PLA is recruiting former pilots across UK, US, Australia, and even France. Why are they doing this?
So I think the People's Liberation Army is trying to recruit pilots formerly from the militaries of the United Kingdom, France, United States, and Australia, because they think that they can learn the techniques, tactics, and procedures that their air forces use, or navies and armies in some cases, use whenever it might come into a potential conflict with one of those countries in some ways, or at least to improve their own training.
What are the governments doing to try to stop this trend?
I think it's important for the United States to encourage dialogue and make sure that their ally partners, treaty ally partners, like the three other countries we mentioned, are doing more to ensure legislatively that this sort of involvement of former military personnel in the defense complex or military complex of countries like China is illegal, and that this would be tied to things like retirement, pension, facing jail time, other sort of means of being able to deter former personnel from wanting to engage in working with a military like the People's Liberation Army, not only because it's not in their best interests, but it's also not in the national security interests of these respective countries.
You said it's not in the interests of the pilots themselves, but obviously they think it is. I mean, the salaries are highly lucrative.
I think it speaks to potentially some of the lack of opportunities that some of these individuals might feel once they get out of their service. I also think it speaks to a lack of clearness in making it very known that this kind of work, given the sort of competition that the United States has with the People's Liberation Army and China broadly, that this is not welcome. And I think that also the governments of these different countries could potentially do things to encourage them to not want to work for future adversaries, like maybe setting up talent pipeline programs with, not that there aren't already pipelines for former military pilots to go into commercial service and other things. But I do think it's worth exploring more opportunities to work with private industry so that there's more opportunities provided to former military personnel so that they don't feel like they need to go to a place like China and work with the People's Liberation Army to help increase their own defense and military readiness.
Is this a phenomenon that's quite new, or has it been going on for a while?
I can't speak to whether or not this is something that's been going on for a while. I mean, there are historic cases of former military personnel helping across centuries, helping new sort of emerging military powers build up their own defenses. I think the Meiji Restoration and the arms building of Imperial Japan is a very good example of that, because we're sharing a lot of the same defense platforms, weapon systems, aircraft, and whatnot. Having former military personnel from a NATO country or from another U.S. treaty ally going to go work with the People's Liberation Army is very dangerous in the long term, and could provide a better insight into how the United States and some of its allies could respond to a contingency related to Taiwan militarily.
I was interested in finding out about the French pilots. The report said that they were of particular interest to the PLA because of the pilots that fly off aircraft carriers. Can you talk about any sort of very specific skills or experience that the PLA is looking for at this moment?
So I think I can't speak to any of the specific skills or experiences that the PLA is looking for, other than what you just mentioned. I think the desire to want to gain better understandings, or rather more experience working on platforms like aircraft carriers, makes sense. I also think in the case of France, obviously, as many in Taiwan know, Taiwan still uses the Mirage 2000s. There's also a little bit of a desire to want to understand how those platforms work, in addition to Taiwanese military personnel having had the opportunity to train on those platforms in France, which has been known in Taiwan for a long time. I think that's a big element of it. But I think there's also a desire to want to understand how to have more combat readiness. You also have to remember the People's Liberation Army currently does not have any veterans in it. And because of that, there's also a desire in many People's Liberation Army related writings to want to figure out how can we gain more experience. And I think one of those ways that that can be substituted, or rather the People's Liberation Army is attempting to substitute that, is by gaining insight from former pilots from the United States and some of the allies we just mentioned, like France.
Do you see any parallels with the US's chip export controls on China? So technology and military.
I think there's a little bit of a parallel there in terms of trying to stop US citizens from assisting those efforts to similarly what we found with some of these pilots with the People's Liberation Army. And I do think that that is kind of a good analogy and maybe even potentially a good model for something that, Congress could make more explicit. Any sort of US citizen or national that's viewed as trying to actively support the Chinese military in some way, that is not good and could be met with, jail time or something along those lines.
Could there be legislation that extends to, any former pilots that had worked on American weapons or military systems?
Yes, I do think that there can be. And I think a really good example would be anyone involved in the F-35 project, given how multinational that's been and the focus on US allies and partners through that project. I think that's just one good example. There's many, many other defense platforms where the United States has trained many other former personnel across the world, ally and partner alike, where that would be very sensitive. And I do think that there could be more stringent restrictions put on those individuals as well.
So in the UK, we understand through the media reports that there were up to 30 pilots. That seems to be the largest number from any country, at least reported. Does that reflect at all on the UK?
I don't know if I could say that that necessarily reflects on the UK as a whole. I do think that it means that the United States should continue to have further conversations with UK defense officials. And I do think with the new prime minister who came in, Rishi Sunak, and there's more of a desire to want to continue pushing on issues of mutual concern through the special relationship, that the Biden administration is really well positioned. And also in the UK, there's been like an evolution within the last few years to recognize that China's more of a threat. I think that there are many individuals in the UK who work in the policy space who would be very willing to work with the United States on this issue. But I think it comes down to whether or not the US is able to convey the seriousness of it, and whether or not policymakers in the UK continue to view China as being a threat to them as well. And I think that conversation has really evolved in a way that I don't think it would have been maybe 5-6 years ago.